You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hi there, welcome to Campus Talks, the podcast in which we seek insights to aid the work of those in higher education. I'm Miranda Prynne, and this week I'm learning about the dynamic and demanding world of research spin-outs and what it takes to successfully commercialise academic endeavours. Building a business from scratch is never an easy task, but for an academic, the challenges may be compounded by a lack of commercial experience and the complexities of transforming a specific research finding into something commercially viable. And yet, for many researchers, commercialisation offers the best route to see their work translated into products and services that will have a lasting real-world impact. And of course, for a fortunate few, it can also result in big financial returns. To demystify the process of moving from the laboratory to the boardroom, I spoke to a US-based biomedical researcher who has now founded 5 startup companies, each telling a very different story, as we'll hear. Ashutosh Chilkoti is the Alan L. Kaganov Professor of Biomedical Engineering in the Pratt School of Engineering at Duke University in the US, and the brains behind companies including PhaseBio Pharmaceuticals, Sentilus, and Insolere Bio. He runs the Chilkoti Research Group at Duke, where entrepreneurship is very much encouraged and supported among the early career researchers, some of whom have gone on to run the spin-outs emanating from the lab. Ashutosh himself is a firm proponent of commercialisation and all it offers, and has driven initiatives at Duke designed to support entrepreneurship among students and staff. As well as hearing about his own varied startup experiences, I was keen for him to break down the process of developing a research finding into a business, and to get his insight on what investors look for, but also find out how institutions can best support their academics in commercialisation. So, let's hear from Ashutosh. Hi Ashutosh, it's great to speak to you. Welcome to Campus Talks.
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
As well as securing a staggering 180 US patents over the course of your research work, you have also founded 5 startup companies. Can you give us a brief run through of these enterprises and how each developed to where they are now?
Sure. The first company I started was PhaseBio. So PhaseBio started in around 2000. It was via an accidental meeting with somebody who was as young as I was. We were in our 30s. He was sort of a very early VC. We happened to meet. We were at a meeting on nanotechnology. We hit it off. I showed him a paper I had published. He had his brother, who was a chemistry professor, check it out, who said, "This looks real. Maybe you guys should get together." And we did, and that was a company with a lot of twists and turns. Started as a protein purification company, which nobody was interested in. Turned into a drug delivery company in the around 2004. So it took about 4 years of wandering around. And then finally had some success, did a bunch of clinical trials, and then did an IPO on NASDAQ in 2018. It looked great, but COVID and a lot of other financial issues hit the company, and it ran out of cash around 2022. Went bankrupt, and all that IP has now been auctioned off to a company in Korea, which is Immunoforge, which is now taking it forward into the clinic. So hopefully that technology will see the light of day, will cure patients, or will lead to a product in the not so distant future. I'll move on to the next ones faster because they're shorter stories. Second company was Sentilus, point-of-care clinical diagnostics out of my lab. It was just really me and the other co-founder, Angus Hucknall, a grad student who sort of stuck it out with me because he wanted to start this company. Started the company in 2012. We were looking for strategic partners, a CEO. We were trying to raise some money through some friends, some contacts. We were put in touch with a company named Immucore, which is a privately held but large diagnostics company, blood diagnostics. They came, they kicked the tires, checked it out, had us do a few experiments, and said they really liked it. They just wanted to buy it out. So 2 years after it was started, they just basically bought out all the assets of the company, which is really the IP and the technology that we had to that point. So that was number 2. Number three was Isolere Bio, which was actually PhaseBio rebooted. So it was sort of PhaseBio 2.0. PhaseBio started as a protein purification company, where this technology that we had developed could be used to purify proteins without chromatography. It would also be adapted to deliver drugs. So PhaseBio became a drug delivery company. But the original idea, which we had failed to commercially develop because at that point, there really weren't that many protein drugs out there. I mean, antibodies were just starting in the early 2000s as drugs. By 2015, they'd beaten Moore's law, I think. And the volume of antibodies is enormous. The technology used to purify them is chromatography, is protein A chromatography, which was, they were starting to feel the pain of running these large columns, very expensive columns. And so our technology would get rid of protein A chromatography entirely. One person came to see me and said he'd read that paper, and sort of he actually encouraged me to reboot the company, which I did with a local entrepreneur, Jim McMahon, and a recently graduated student, absolutely brilliant student, Kelly Luganbull. She started off as the first employee, as the CSO, Chief Scientific Officer, which is kind of a bit of a joke. I said, you can have any title you want. She picked CSO. She turned out to be so good at raising money through grants and running the company as she hired other people. We made her the CEO. And then we raised a bit of money, not very much from VCs. And so about 4 or 5 years after it was launched, as in 2023, we sold to Donaldson, which is a large industrial filtration company, because they saw the synergies, they saw the complementarity between their technologies and us. They wanted to go into biotech, but they didn't know the language. We had the right product that aligned with their filtration products. Anyway, it was a nice all cash deal. Everybody did well. And that was number three. Number four was launched a year after Isolere. That's Insoma Bio, a different take on the same kind of technology, all based on phase behavior of biopolymers. Insoma's technology was kind of cool in the sense that it's a liquid that turns into porous solid in the body, and it has really nice. It's very biocompatible. So that company is developing a new injectable biomaterial for tissue repair. We started in 2019, raised again a usual recent model, lots of SBIR money, non-dilutive money from the federal government, money from sort of angel investors, and that's doing fairly well so far, touch wood. We just did our first two patients in September, and we sent the report off to the FDA. And actually, as of last week, we received permission from the FDA to do the next 6 or 8 patients. I think it's a 10-patient trial. It's the first in human safety trial, but that's a really important trial. So that's that. And then my two more. Whale Therapeutics, which is a company to replace polyethylene glycol, which is the most ubiquitous polymer used in extending the half-life of proteins. So you attach PEG to proteins or DNA or whatever, or you put it on lipid nanoparticles, and that has a lot of useful properties, increases circulation time, and so on. But PEG is showing its age. It has antibodies. We have a technology where we tweaked PEG, sort of changed the architecture, and have gotten rid of that problem. And that's called Whale Therapeutics. And we are developing a drug, going after a protein drug where the PEG is the problem, not the drug. Number five is Simplest Diagnostics, which is actually the second company rebooted. So first diagnostics company was Sentilus, point of care diagnostics, that sold very early, 2 to 3 years into sort of after inception. Immucor took it, bought a bunch of other companies, and were trying to develop it. But then one fine day, they decided to can all their R&D, fired everybody, shut it all down. So 3 years later, 4 years later, Immucor is acquired by Werfen. Werfen called me and said, the lawyer said, we're getting rid of all these patents. Do you want them back? So after much negotiations, we bought back some of the technology. In the intervening 10 years, we had received about $25 million of funding from the US government and other sources, and we had really developed the technology where it's a beta prototype. We have chips, detectors, we can test things in real time. So the team in the last 10 years that developed it sort of stuck around because they believe in the technology, and so we're all co-founders. And so Simplest Diagnostics is this point of care that's sort of a much greater stage of maturity, and we're now trying to take it forward.
That's fascinating in that every single one of those startups has a different story, and it just really highlights the twisty or the topsy-turvy world of trying to commercialize research, and how it can go fantastically well for a while and then, something very much out of your control, like the company who's bought it, for instance, deciding for whatever reason it can't continue, or financial issues mean that this incredibly important and valuable IP might get left by the wayside. Let's start with PhaseBio, because that didn't run entirely smoothly. I mean, what did that first experience teach you?
Oh, it taught me everything. As sort of one of the VCs said that was involved with, he said, Tosh, this is going to be your on-the-job MBA. You're going to really learn how to do this through this company. And he was absolutely right. It was an invaluable lesson. This company, was largely VC funded. So I got to see up close how the US VC model works because we raised an insane amount of money, what I think is insane. 150 or maybe $180 million in the lifetime of the company before it went public, and then raised more money after it went public. So I sort of saw what it takes to play in the big leagues. And I don't take credit for it. The original VC I worked with, Clay Thorpe, really was the driver behind raising all this money. I was there for the ride. I would do some presentations with him, but I got to see what it takes to raise enormous amounts of money. And also, there are pros and cons when you go down that route. And I got to see the pros and cons, and that sort of taught me or convinced me to try a different model with my other companies, which I call the organic slow growth model with a nod to the slow food movement, right? Raise less money, be more patient, take more time, but try and control the destiny of your company.
Yes. And just coming back to your overview of these various companies, the first thing that strikes me is it sounds like a huge amount of work that you're needing to do alongside a no doubt incredibly busy academic schedule, running a large research group. So how did you balance, or how do you balance that dual demand?
Well, my wife would say I have no work-life balance. I sort of work all the time. But truthfully, it's not that much. It is a lot of work, but it is not as much work as you would think because I'm not a micromanager. So, for example, the companies, I don't work for the companies. I'm a co-founder. I sometimes even put some money into the companies. Actually, I do in many cases, some seed money. But I try and find really great people. And increasingly, those are the people who have done the work in my lab who are also entrepreneurial. So not every grad student or postdoc is entrepreneurial. And so they own it. They take it out. They're the ones killing themselves. I'm there sort of as a support person. I'm there as and when they need me, which with each company varies a lot. Sometimes I'm on the phone like every day for like a week when something big is going on, and sometimes I don't hear from them for a couple of weeks or a month. So, it sort of ebbs and flows and balances itself out. And I also sort of enjoy it because it gets me out of the university. So you sort of have two different lives, which makes life more interesting. And I guess gives me sort of level of enthusiasm for each job.
How do you first spot when something has commercial potential? Can you explain how that process unfolds?
Yeah, there is kind of an aha moment. I think the first one is you realize you have ended up solving a problem that needs to be solved. I think the big problem in academia is we all love our problems, but some of the problems are very academic, meaning that they're important, they push science forward, but they aren't solving a problem the society needs solved at this time, right? That's how you create products, solve a problem that people care about. So, I don't set out to solve problems, to tell you the truth. I joke about it. I say I just invent new kinds of hammers because I love developing new technology. I don't really think about if I'm solving a problem with it or not. But occasionally I find that my hammer sort of is, the right hammer for the right nail, and the nail is a problem that needs to be pounded. That's where the solution is. So mixed metaphors there or something. But in any case, I think you get the general idea. So not everything I do leads to a company, obviously. I've done many different things, but occasionally you sort of have this aha moment and say, oh my God, I've invented this new technology and I think it solves this problem. Then you dive deeper, and sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. If it's true, that's the first sign you have a company. And the second sign is you ask yourself, if I'm solving a problem, it's rare that you are the only one to attack that problem. There may already be an existing solution. Is your solution so much better, right? Not just incrementally better, but better by an order of magnitude. At least twice as good, if not 10 times as good. I mean, tough to put numbers on this, but you have to have a sense that your solution is much, much better than what exists out there, because what exists out there is probably the current solution which dominates the market. If you want to displace something, you'd have to be far, far better.
Yes, to use marketing jargon, it needs to have a unique selling point, a
Yes,
USP.
right.
So once you've identified that potential, what then are the next practical steps?
Well, so, in preparation for that this might happen, anytime we develop a new technology, we file patents through Duke. So I would say every third or fourth paper leads to a patent application that Duke files. So you always sort of working in preparation for the day where you might recognize that this technology has a life outside the university, which means you have to have intellectual property protection, right? So we're always doing that. And then at that point, we say, okay, it's time to do something with it. And you have two choices. You can try and license it, but my experience has been that very early stage university technology is not something industry is prepared to license, at least not anymore. They want something much more baked. I mean, it's gotten bad enough that if you're developing a new drug delivery system, for example, they want to see first in human data, right? Phase one, phase two. So practically, I found in my career that the only option is if I believe in a technology and I think, I can create a product to serve society, I have to start a company. So we start a company. I mean, I've been working with these lawyers for 20 years, so I just call them up and say, I'm going to start a company. And, the next step is you come up with a name. It takes a lot of time to come up with a name you like. Come up with a name, file, create a company out of Delaware. So you have entity and paper, and then we negotiate with Duke to pull the technology out. And thankfully, it's become a pretty seamless process because I've done it a few times, and Duke has a fantastic person who runs the whole technology transfer program. So I work with Robin Razor, and we agree to a license to the licensing terms, and then Duke licenses to the company. So now you have an entity that has the technology, but that's only part of the puzzle. You need people to run it, and increasingly, it's been the students who've done the work. I guess I'm also seem to attract entrepreneurial students who join my lab. And so, for example, Insolere was Kelly Lugenbooth, who had just graduated, had been working with this technology. In Soma Bio, Stefan Roberts, who actually invented the technology. He was a grad student who did the work, and he really wanted to start this company. In fact, he sort of pushed me along and said, we really should do this. I was a little bit skeptical initially because I thought, this is just too early stage. So, and so pretty much the last 3 or 4 companies have had people deeply involved in setting up and running the company who are also involved in inventing the technology. So you need the IP, you need people, and then you need money. And that's a different story, right?
Yes, and we will come on to discuss that shortly. I'm interested that you say you actually file patents for, I don't know, every few papers. It's almost like if in doubt, file a patent, which I'm not convinced necessarily happens across the board, because one of the things I've definitely heard in the past when researchers are offering advice on commercializing their work is, don't just publish your work. You've got to consider protecting it first. And obviously you referenced when describing your various startups that often it was based on published papers. But if you'd already patented it, by that point, you've got the protection in place. So then you can kind of plow on with the publication, which clearly you need to support your academic career as much as anything else.
That's right. So yeah, I mean, not everything, I don't patent everything, obviously, so I have to exercise judgment. I patent a fraction of the papers that I'm about to publish. In fact, we do it at the same time. As we're publishing the paper, we're submitting it to our Office of Technology Commercialization, and then I have to convince them to patent it, right? So the trouble there is that there are too many faculty members who want to patent too many things. I would say Duke is probably more generous in patenting things than many other universities. This is just anecdotal information based on talking to my colleagues at other universities who seem to have a lot more trouble. So I think Duke in general is a lot more generous. And I think because I have a bit of a track record, because my patents have actually not just sort of gathered dust, they've been licensed to startups, I think you kind of build up a little bit of credibility, or at least I hope I have. So I think it's probably made it easier for me at Duke to get patents filed. It does help to have a little bit of credibility there. And I think it does help. It certainly helps to have a university that takes a fairly aggressive stance to patenting ideas that faculty members come up with. But that does require a budget.
And as you say, a genuine interest and support of this process. Have you made any really notable mistakes when setting up companies that have shaped your approach since?
Yeah, a couple of mistakes. I think the first company, it wasn't really a mistake. It was that I didn't know anything about entrepreneurship. I didn't even think I was going to be an entrepreneur. I'm completely the accidental entrepreneur. And I wish I knew what I was doing. I just sort of stumbled into it and stumbled through it, and probably didn't help the people I was working with very much. I wish I had spent more time in the lab, kind of fleshing out the ideas, de-risking them, doing the work to take the company forward with less, that would have required a lesser infusion of cash. The first dollars are really the most expensive dollars, and you can waste a lot of time and money. And if you're going to noodle around and sort of not waste time, but sort of, flesh things out, it's probably, my conclusion now is it's best done within the lab.
Does that tie into your strategy? You said you pivoted after setting up PhaseBio from taking this very kind of fast growth approach. Obviously, you raised loads of money very quickly. but also kind of delegated a lot of the control quite quickly, to moving to a slower process where I guess you're developing the technology perhaps a bit further and retaining more control over it. Does that tie into what you just said, that you do more in the lab? Can you unpick that a bit more for me?
So the idea is, we try and do kind of all the sort of core science in the lab. And then when we launch the company, we don't immediately raise money from VCs because when a VC comes in at a very early stage, they're going to take control, right? That money is extremely expensive. So instead, we start out by sort of living in a low-cost incubator, renting a desk and a bench with one or two employees. We raise a little bit of money from friends and family, just enough to pay salaries initially, but we then aggressively sort of apply for federal funding through small business innovation research, SBIRs and STTRs, and we've been very fortunate there. So in every company within the first year, we've raised $500,000 to $1 million. That sort of provides the funding to pay for people, hire a few employees, do some experiments. And we keep doing that till we get to a point where it sort of hit the next inflection point, then we raise sort of a small sum of money, just a few $1 million at a time, $2 to $4 or $5 million, largely from individual investors. I find that we can get better terms by doing that. And then we only go to VCs when we have sort of grown to a point where we think we can control the conversation, so to speak, much more than we could have at the inception of the company.
Interesting. And in your experience, what do funders want to see from these fledgling companies? Let's perhaps start with individual investors or angel investors.
I think angel investors have many different motivations. Some of them have a lot of money and they're looking for sort of very orthogonal investments to what they have, right? So they're willing to take a lot of risk and they're willing to have a longer timeline. They're putting in, these are people worth a lot of money and they're putting in 100, $200,000 at a time. So some of these investors make a lot of these small bets, assuming some will fail, some will succeed. And then often what's also convoluted into all of this is that there's also a bit of philanthropy. They are also investing in the technology, A, because they think it's kind of cool, B, it gets them closer to the science, they like talking science in some cases, and C, they may have a personal reason, right? They may have a sort of family personal reason to invest in that particular area. And that's particularly true when it is things like biomedical technologies, right? Because if you are starting a company that's creating a drug delivery platform that's applied to a certain disease, they may have had a family member who suffered from it and so on. So I tend to find that individual investors tend to have a sort of complex set of reasons, some of which are convoluted together, but it makes it interesting to work with them because they actually really care about the technology and are willing to have a long timeline in most cases.
The advantage, I guess, of working in biotech is you are generally doing very good things for humanity. So there is that very strong incentive as well. What about VCs? Is there a big difference in terms of the culture of what they're looking for?
So, I think with big VCs, that things tend to move in waves and cycles and themes, right? So if you were doing CRISPR at one point, you could do a 200 million Series A. If you are now doing AI, large language models, the big money follows what are seen as big ideas. If you happen to be working in those areas, you can raise gobs and gobs of money. If you're working in other areas that aren't as fashionable, shall we say, it can get a lot more difficult to raise money. That's the first thing. Second thing is they're sort of looking for return on investment in a certain time frame. VCs have pretty significant constraints, right? They have to sort of do better than the stock market, at least that's their hope, in a finite time window. And so they feel like they have to invest in certain things where the exits are going to be very, very large. Not every useful idea is going to give you a 20x exit. It may only give you a 3x, 5x exit. And that's where, angels are fine with that. If you triple the money in 10 years, it's not going to change their lives, but they've been part of a journey and they've sort of made some money and they're fine with that. So I think there's a disproportionate amount of money at least in the biomedical field in the US that goes into certain areas, and then the other areas sort of have more difficulty in raising money.
Yeah, so VCs are more subject to trends, ultimately.
I would say so.
Their job is to make money. It is to get a return on the investment, and therefore I can see they'd be much more closely aligned to market trends and things that are on the zeitgeist of offering great returns. You set up an incubator, Bridge, for biomedical engineering faculty and student startups, and the Duke Engineering Entrepreneurship Program, DEEP, which is a postdoctoral fellowship program for recent PhD grads in the department who are interested in entrepreneurship. So you're obviously doing a lot to kind of encourage and support entrepreneurship across your department. Why are you so keen to see others get involved in this particular area?
So just to give some context, I did it when I was the head of, I guess you would call it head of the department in the UK. Here we call it the chair of the department. And so I joke about it. I was a mayor of a small town, and I said, well, I can't really do things on a large scale at Duke, but I can certainly experiment and do things that I care about. And I care about entrepreneurship because I'm an accidental entrepreneur. I've made many mistakes. I wish I'd had more mentorship, more help when I started out. When I started out in the early 2000s, there really was very little entrepreneurship, at least in the School of Engineering at Duke. It was largely in the medical school. So I had to learn in the School of Hard Knocks. And what I wanted to do for the younger faculty in my department and the students was to make sure that they didn't go through the same sort of somewhat painful process I went through. I wanted to make it easier because I think we are biomedical engineers. I'm a biomedical engineer in a biomedical engineering department, and engineers, our job is to serve society, right? Is to take fundamental science, turn that science into products that serve society. I think that's sort of a wonderful thing. I'm very proud of being an engineer. So entrepreneurship is a key part of that. It's one of the most important ways in which we can take basic knowledge and turn it into products. And I wanted to make that journey easier, more seamless for the next generation. And so the incubator was something I identified as a real need. I wanted an incubator which would be like renting a small studio apartment for your kids when they move off to New York or London or whatever, right? $700, $800, something where you could just literally fund it yourself to launch a company. I wanted to be extremely cost efficient. Many commercial incubators are not cost efficient. They have too many bells and whistles. They're very expensive. So I wanted to create something that was even cheaper than a commercial incubator. And then the DEEP program came from the realization that there were a number of grad students who were about to graduate with a PhD, and they realized, oh my God, I could have a company here, but I'm running out of time. And my PhD advisor may or may not be interested in taking this forward, and this is just going to die, and it's a terrible feeling. So I wanted to give them the chance to stick around for a year or two and see if they could take their PhD research and turn it into a company. So that was sort of the two things I thought that could have an immediate impact on the younger faculty and students who wanted to start companies. And also, the DEEP program allowed students to kind of flesh out ideas and see if there was a company there or not.
If an institution does really want to turbocharge its tech transfer and spin out activity, and it sounds like Duke is very strong in this area, what basic support do you think an institution does need to have in place for this?
So, it starts out with filing, being fairly aggressive in filing patents. It's a chicken and egg problem, right? You need money for it. Duke has done quite well in terms of revenues it has gotten back from its IP. So some of that money gets funneled into the office that files the patents. But in the absence of that, universities have to take a leap and say, this will all work out, but we're going to put money in, put skin in the game, put our own money in, file lots and lots of patents, because without patents, there will be no licenses to companies and there will certainly be no startups. It has to start there. I think that's the most important thing. And then the second thing is something that I think universities are increasingly doing. They're creating a whole sort of ecosystem, an educational mentorship ecosystem to help people along in terms of starting companies, right? Sort of teaching people what it takes, faculty and students, to start a company. The sort of steps you take, mistakes to avoid, how to go through the mechanics that I learned just by doing. But now there's sort of a much easier path where you can go through workshops. You can be assigned, if you have a new company you want to start, Duke will find you a mentor in residence, a former corporate executive or startup person who happens to be living in the area who will spend 10 hours a week working with you on your ideas. So I think providing sort of the intellectual framework, the sort of the ecosystem to help move ideas forward into a company is the second thing. And then the third thing is money. And I think Duke has done something interesting there. I think many universities have, where they've gathered together a number of rich alumni and created sort of an angel investment fund, right? Where faculty members can make pitches to these people and they can decide to put their money in or not. And at Duke, it's now called DCP, I believe, Duke Capital Partners. Before that was called Duke Angel Network. So it's a bunch of wealthy Duke alums who have banded together, put some money in, and in fact DCPs run almost like a small VC fund now. They have staff and so on. But you can apply to DCP and say, I'm doing a Duke startup. I'd like to present my ideas and see if they'll put in a few $1 million. So these are the three things, right? You have to sort of file the patents, then you have to sort of understand how to go through the mechanics and start a company, get the right team, identify the right, make sure you're solving the right problem. That's where these entrepreneur residents can be very good. They can tell you this is a problem that doesn't need to be solved because they've been doing this for a long time. And then finally the money. And I think most universities are woken up to the fact that you need to attack all three simultaneously if you're going to have a hope that your companies will make it.
Yes, and drawing on your alumni makes complete sense. I mean, as you say, I think a number of universities are doing this. I think the US is somewhat ahead of the UK, but universities in the UK are also creating their own VC funds of sorts. I mean, you've been engaged in this work for nearly 25 years. You started your first company back in the early 2000s. What changes have you observed over that time about, well, perhaps the process, but also what funders are looking for?
Some things haven't changed. I mean, the big VCs sort of put money into what they see as the big market moving ideas. But I think one thing that has changed is there's just a lot more VCs now. It's incredible the number of VC funds. I mean, it used to be that you kind of knew the big players back then, but now they're like suddenly you'll see another $1 billion fund emerge out of nowhere that you hadn't heard of. So there's a lot more money, but there's also, I think, the competition has also gone up. I mean, entrepreneurship in America, startups have really compared to 2026 versus 2000, I think there's just so many more startups now. So more money, but also more competition. It's just become a lot more noisy in the last 25 years. But I think my sense is sources of funding have also diversified in the sense that, or perhaps I'm just naive, maybe there were always angels investing back then. But I feel like a lot more people, there are many more individual investors now. And there certainly are many more of these angel networks, which is individuals banding together. There was no Duke angel networks 25 years ago, for example.
Sort of makes sense. There would be more people involved just because the nature of how technology and digital technology has changed the way we all live and work. It's democratized all of these things. So the kind of access to networks and the information and how to get involved would be much more accessible. And within a few offices of well-informed financiers, suddenly a lot of people can find out how to get involved in investment.
I think you make a very good point. I think the web has democratized things a lot. It's a lot easier for me as a academic to sort of find different sources of funding than it was 25 years ago.
We can't finish this conversation without touching on the more recent massive upheaval to US science and research under the second Trump administration. What impact has this all had on US spin-out activity?
Yes, so it turns out the US government is one of the largest VCs, and they're the best in the sense that it's non-dilutive capital. So a certain fraction, I think it's 3 or 3.5% of, let's say, the money given out by major federal funding agencies like the NIH, NSF, Department of Energy, has to go by law towards small companies through a program called the Small Business Innovation Research Program or the Small Technology Transfer Research Program, SPIR, STTR. They're two very similar programs. Companies can write proposals either alone in the SPIR program or in collaboration with an academic in the STTR program. You send a proposal into the NIH just the way you would send an academic would send in a proposal for basic science research. It gets reviewed by a panel, and if you get a good enough score, then you will get money, which could be, for example, phase one SPIR or STTRs at NIH can be as much as $250,000. You write 6 pages. If the idea is found worthy, you get $250,000, and the turnaround is very quick, much quicker than basic science research funding. And then if your work goes well in phase one, you can apply for a phase two, which is over $1 million at NSF and up to $2 million at NIH. So this is, serious money. And the US government takes no stake in it, in the company, right? So this is, in a sense, free money. It's a great driver of innovation in America. If you cannot get VC money early on or don't want to take VC money early on, this is the best way of building your company. In the last 3 of companies that I've started, we have done this. We aggressively write SBIR, STTRs and have been quite successful. So there's been sort of upheaval in the basic science fund and so on. But in the spin-out activity, what has really affected us has been the fact that the SPI or SCTR program is defunct. For some obscure reason, it seems to constantly need congressional reauthorization every few years. Anyway, the last one ran out in October, and the government shut down, and we still don't have reauthorization of the SPI or SCTR program. So, you could have had a great score waiting to be funded, and this is a matter of life and death for some young companies. And suddenly the money isn't going to show up. So the fact that the program has sort of been in limbo for close to 6 months now is devastating for young companies that are trying to build themselves through SPR money. There's no substitute for the federal government in terms of seeding new companies. The US government has done an exceptional job of seeding new companies through this very far-sighted, progressive program.
Well, yes. I mean, the US innovation and enterprise is the envy of the world. And I suspect this is a large part of why it's so effective. Will the recent ruling by Congress that will protect certainly the NSF and NIH budgets, is that likely to make any difference to this and get things moving again?
Oh, absolutely. So the two things. One, I said, that this program is in limbo, but we are hearing encouraging signs that Congress is very close to reauthorizing the program, and we will all let out a big sigh of relief, cheers when it happens. So that's one problem. The second problem is the SPR and STR budget is a percentage of the total budget. So, for example, if NSF had been cut by 40%, then the SPR budget for NSF would have been cut by 40%, right? So, yes, it's wonderful that NSF only got cut 3.5%, which is still unfortunate, but it's not 40% or 50%. And NIH actually got a 1% increase. So, the fact that the research budget was largely preserved by Congress is great news also for entrepreneurship, because these programs get a fraction of the overall budget.
And what do you make of noises the administration has been making about wanting to take a cut of patents from federally funded research?
And it's worrying because the reason I think entrepreneurship has worked so well is that the US government has given out money with no strings attached and not gotten involved in owning shares in companies and stakes in companies, which would get very messy. But it has paid off for the US government because it has paid off for the US economy. When a company succeeds, it provides employment to people locally, it generates wealth. It's, the closest thing we have to alchemy. Take base metal, turn it into gold. I mean, what could be better for society than to have ideas, fundamental science, turn into a technology that's developed in a lab, and then that turns into a product?
To finish, each spin out is very different, as we've heard, and I'm guessing you thus learn new things every time and have to keep adapting. But are there any universally sound pieces of advice that you might offer to someone looking to set up a spin out?
Well, I think two things. One is make sure you're solving a problem that the world wants solved, not just that you want to solve. This is a trap academics fall into. And second, find somebody to own the idea, own the company. If you're not going to leave university and run the company, then you have to have somebody who is deeply passionate, who's going to dedicate the next 5 to 10 years of their life to living and breathing and dreaming about this company. I think those are the two key things I would say.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me today, Ashutosh. It's been a great pleasure.
My pleasure too. Thank you so much for inviting me.
While Ashutosh does not shy away from the difficulties of building successful spin-outs, he does break down the most important components in quite simple terms. First, are you solving a problem that others want solved? Then, have you protected your intellectual property? Do you have the right team or expertise in place to run the company? And finally, what is your best funding route? So, while building a startup is never a simple or linear process, it is clear that Ashutosh believes it is the best way to get your research out there. And given he still believes that, 5 companies down the line, with all the ups and downs that entails, his opinion should carry some weight. For anyone with an eye to future enterprise, I hope that provides some useful considerations, as while Ashutosh is in the US, the same principles apply wherever you are based. If you enjoyed listening, please like and subscribe, and Campus Talks will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.